Good evening. Welcome to Street Talk. I know we've had to take a little bit of a hiatus on doing new shows. Unfortunately, one of our crew here recently passed, Raymond Martins. I'd actually worked with him as part of his brain injury program for the last 13 years, and he unfortunately passed from brain cancer. And so we've been without a sound person for the last bunch of months, and obviously I hadn't been able to take the time off to be able to be involved with the show. And Father Russ is out in the New London area, busy as ever. But obviously we had to come back because we need to inform the state about what's going on. And who better to come inform us about all the doings up in the state? Our good friend Gail Lavielle from on 143rd.
Hi, Dominic. It's it's always good to be here. I'm really flattered you asked me to come for your first day back.
I'm happy to have you here. I mean, obviously, we got the news. And I think it probably took everybody a couple of days to digest about what the governor's kind of doing to rebalance the state, as I call it. And I, you know, after looking at it, I kind of feel like he's really putting cities and towns at odds with each other, with the way that they're placing their financial priorities within that. And I know we have big deficits to get through, and this all there's shared sacrifice, and you know then they're slaughtering us at the altar, so they can feed like other people. I know for my city. The two biggest hits that we looked at were educational cost sharing. I know we lost some $11 million, you know, in our funding. We're actually, I think, down to zero. And then the other big one is moving teachers' pensions from being a state obligation to being, I think, approximately a third obligation of cities. And who knows where like the rest of the aid is going to come from? But I know it's well, you're down in Fairfield County. I mean, you got a little hit and miss. Did Norwalk at least get something?
Well, I'll tell you about it, sort of. Just for anyone who doesn't know, I'm sure that's most of the world. I represent two small towns, Wilton and Westport. I live in Wilton, and then I represent quite a big segment of the city of Norwalk. So I kind of have both the urban and the suburban type towns in my district. It's interesting what's going on here. The educational part of the redistribution of the allocation of state funds does indeed take away from what are classified as the wealthier towns. And the definition of wealthier is interesting, isn't it?
It's getting smaller and smaller.
And yeah, well, I mean, Milford got hit very, very hard.
Oh yeah.
Lots of places got hit very, very hard. There is a reallocation taking place in his budget with educational funds from the wealthier towns to the much less wealthy cities. That's clear, and we can talk more about how that happens in that proposal, but that's what's happening. The teacher's pension contribution part does not do that. It simply reallocates a third of that expense every year from the state budget to the budget of every single town and city in Connecticut. So that's indiscriminately, whether you are wealthy or poor or something in between. The, local budgets have to give up 30% in this proposal, I keep saying that because this is not a done deal,
Yeah.
10% of the total of their salary for teachers to the state to pay the contribution annually into the teachers' pension fund. So those two things are what we're talking about. One is a cities versus towns thing, and the other one is all municipalities versus the state thing. And I don't mean to say versus, but let's just say that for the purposes of shorthand.
I mean, I guess, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one. Here's the issue that I really have. If I thought that the money was actually going to education,
That's right.
and I thought cities like Bridgeport, which have taken huge hits, and I can understand. If I thought that $19 million was going to go towards education, and yes, I do know a few members of the Board of Education over there, and I'm sure they probably tell me it's more than likely that's going to get shifted off to somewhere else, then I would say I would have a little more compassion about the set of circumstances. But no, here's my, and this is the top of the list. Hartford is getting $45 million. $45 million, and that's not going to go to help their students.
You're absolutely right. This is absolutely clear. The two small towns that I represent, Wilton and Westport, are getting almost nothing as it is.
Right.
And so for that to, if there's some mandate relief and return, and were that to go to a school for children who aren't getting a proper education, that would at least mean something. It would have some significance. It would be a little easier to swallow. But in fact, the mayor of Hartford recently said, of course I'm not going to use it all for our schools. We have a lot of money already invested in our schools. Hartford is on the verge of bankruptcy. We need this to keep our budget intact. So in fact, the education money may well be used, and there's no guarantee that it won't. The governor's budget director, Ben Barnes, made a presentation to the Appropriations Committee last week. I now sit on the Finance Committee instead of the Appropriations Committee, so we're getting our presentation today. But, well, this is an evening show, but we're filming, we're taping in the morning.
We're taping during the day, it's all right.
So we will have our presentation today. But on Friday, Appropriations had theirs, and he acknowledged to the Appropriations Committee that, in fact, all of that education money will not go to education. So that is a problem. And then when you go back to the contribution to the teachers' pension funds, well, Hartford has to pay that too. Everybody has to pay that. And I think there are some real problems with that, in addition to the fact that it's a whole lot of money. And can I take a step back and just
of course.
Since this is right after essentially the proposal was delivered to the legislature.
Yeah.
So the governor came and made his proposal. He made the whole thing public last Wednesday, the 8th of February. And he outlined all these things. He doesn't, just for anyone who doesn't know, he does not vote on the budget. He doesn't develop the final budget. He provides guidance in his budget proposal to the legislature, which then goes and works on its own. And that's going to take 2 or 2.5 months. That's what usually happens. I think the appropriations, the first vote on the legislature's budget is the end of April. And then we vote in finance, and then it gets all changed again, and then it comes to the House and Senate floor. So this thing we're talking about, we're going to call it the budget, but it's a proposal.
Yes, it is.
And I suspect that it will change quite significantly because there's probably going to be a lot of back and forth on the education portion. The portion that has to do with contributing to the, having the towns contribute to the teachers' pension funds, teachers' pension fund is universally very troubling to everybody. So I don't know what will happen to that, pardon me. But I suspect that some of the flavor of the education portion will remain. I don't know in what way, but I'm just sensing what I hear from the majority in the legislature. There's two parts of that. One is that the education cost sharing formula, which is just the thing that says the state has some general funds for education, and those are distributed to every town according to its wealth and a few student need factors. They've changed some of those factors, but it's still, the town wealth quotient is still based primarily on property values. And so that's getting reallocated a bit so that a lot of towns are now zeroed out. I don't remember if Milford is completely zeroed out.
I think it is. It is.
And then there's the special education portion, which used to be organized, well, there was some of it in the ECS formula, which was just generally given to you no matter what your special needs were, your special education needs were. And then there was a part that was given to a town whenever a child's needs exceeded a certain cost. They've scrapped that, and they've created a new account and allocated special ed funds around the state with respect to that. And that the allocation depends on town wealth. There's an index of town wealth, and that's now how you receive special education funds. So that means significant change to lots and lots and lots of towns, not just the 30 or so wealthiest. And that's one of the reasons that a town like Milford is seeing itself get hit so hard. But you asked me about Norwalk.
Yes, I did.
And I will answer that. I am intrigued by the way Norwalk's allocation has been determined, and I don't understand it.
Okay.
And I'm not happy. Just on the education side, Norwalk and Stamford, as you know, we've talked about it a lot, and you're originally from Norwalk.
I've grown up in the area, so I know it very well.
Exactly. Because Norwalk and Stamford resemble Danbury in every respect, like median income and non-native English speakers and child poverty, whether it's determined by free and reduced lunch or Husky A. They're exactly similar population. Stanford's a little bigger, I think. But in Stamford and Norwalk, the property values are much higher because of the proximity to New York. As a result, Norwalk and Stamford have always gotten ridiculously low education cost sharing allocations. Ridiculously low. Norwalk gets less than half what Danbury gets.
Well, I remember you talking to me about
Exactly.
the need to improve Norwalk's allocation for educational cost sharing because it was uneven.
Still there. And in this budget proposal, the most extraordinary thing has happened in terms of educational cost sharing. Norwalk gets $700,000 more a year than it used to get. Now we're talking about a difference between Norwalk and Danbury of about 12 or 13 million. Okay, Norwalk gets 11 million. So 700,000 is not much progress to filling that gap.
Nope.
Stamford, on the other hand, gets $6 million more. I do not understand why. And I want to get to the bottom of that immediately. I'll start today in this presentation. But that doesn't make sense to me. And so Norwalk continues to be disfavored. Now, in the grand sum of things, they're getting a little more in special ed, but not more than they ever got before. And then there's some other things on the town level, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of evens out or maybe leads to a $2 or $3 million gain. But interestingly, Norwalk would owe through the teacher's pension obligatory contribution. Norwalk would owe $9 million and something a year.
So it's going to be a net lose.
The only way that can even out is if Norwalk imposes property taxes on Norwalk Hospital
Yeah, no,
for an amount
I've
approximately similar to that teacher's pension contribution. So when all this said and done, there's a small gain, but it has nothing to do, I mean, that first off, that assumes that Norwalk would even want to tax Norwalk Hospital that much. And second, it has nothing to do with that education allocation, which is shocking to me.
Again, it comes down to the same situation. If the money that they're proposing actually went to education, it would be one thing, but it's not. But I like to clear up a misnomer about property values and mill rates and everything else along those lines, because everybody compares their mill rates from one town to the next. And I had this argument I don't know, probably about 7 or 8 years ago in our Milford mayoral race, where they were talking about, oh, this person's raised the mill rate or this person's lowered the mill rate. The mill rate depends upon your property evaluation. Mm-hmm. So basically, the way that they do it is kind of similar to appropriations and finance. Is the city goes through, they develop their budget, and then they take a look at the assessment of the properties, and they backfill it with a mill rate to meet their budgetary obligations. So your mill rate can be from, Greenwich, which has a much higher base to be able to take from, is going to be extremely low.
That's right.
As compared to Bridgeport, which has lower property values, your mill rate's going to be a lot higher.
That's right. In fact, all our large cities have very high mill rates.
But the only place that I ever really see this even out, and they brought this up last time around, has to do with car taxes, because you're not changing the value of a car
Right.
from Greenwich to Bridgeport. And so I do know this because I'd have employees when I ran Goodwill, and they would complain about like having to pay $1,500 for car taxes for a car that really wasn't worth that to begin with. So I can understand that piece of it, but comparing the mill rates from one place to the other, no, they're two separate, different things, and I think a lot of people don't really get that, and it bothers me that they don't get that, because I think everybody throws the mill rates around and says, oh, the mill rates in the cities are super high. Well, yeah, your property values aren't as high. You still have to produce your own budget, and you have to backfill the budget based upon, your needs, and that's what sets your mill rate. So if my property valuation goes up and the mill rate goes slightly down, and I'm still paying the same $5,000 a year in property taxes, mill rate doesn't really mean anything. It's the two in relation to each other. And it really, I guess it bothers me that nobody really quite understands that, and I think a lot of people play off of that and take advantage of the community and the way that they present things.
There's a lot of playing going on.
There is.
A whole lot.
It's numbers.
Well, they're very important,
Yeah.
significant numbers, and even in the small towns, these hits are difficult because you're looking in Wilton, you're looking at $4 million hit. In Westport, you're looking at a $6 million hit, and in a place like Norwalk, where you don't actually know, if you start taxing the hospitals even more than they've already been taxed, because they've really been hit on hard, you're going to start diminishing the quality of care. And so it's really not just dig into your budget a little deeper and we hope this is going to work. One of the things that I find curious and extraordinary is this notion of saying, okay, now towns, you're going to be responsible for paying into this teacher's pension fund every year. There's a number of reasons why I find it just extraordinary. I'm not quite sure how you do this. One is that the towns have had no role in negotiating the percentage that teachers pay into the fund. of their salary. I'm not arguing whether the percentage is good or bad. It's just that towns are now going to have to contribute to funding that obligation, and they have had no part in negotiating that contribution, only in negotiating the salaries of the teachers. And that's really, I think, bad for both the state and the towns, that one's doing one thing and one's doing the other. I think it's been strange that they've been separate. So the idea that, you know, that they shouldn't be separate is something else. But the fact is they still are. And this participation in determining ultimately what the amount should be isn't falling on the towns, but they're responsible for it. Okay. It's been the same with the state for a while. Okay. Thing two, what's essentially happening here, most towns and cities in Connecticut have a legislative body or a direct vote from the folks who live there on the town budget. So around in Fairfield County, it's very often the residents who vote. So they're now being asked to vote to send a X percent of their property taxes somewhere else. Okay? When you go down and vote for your budget, if you vote yes, if this thing were to go through, you're voting to send X million dollars to somewhere outside your town, okay, that you have paid in property taxes. Are people going to do that? I don't know.
Well, I know my good friend Kathy Johnson, who is right here in Oxford. I know she's going to have a ruckus house because they all come in town hall style, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of
Right.
people that are going to be complaining about this whole situation.
Yes, I can only imagine, because it is it's hard not to see this as a de facto property tax increase, or I've called them property tax increases in disguise.
They're not in disguise. I
they're-
figured it out. But mine's about it's going to be about 10 to 20%.
Yeah.
On average.
And then there's another point which you bring up about the education side, but here as well. I will find this out. But okay, let's say that your town does, it goes through, and that this budget goes through, and the town's obligated to pay that contribution. Do we have any guarantee that when that money goes to the state, that's where it's going to go? How do we know? It's like the transportation lockbox that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
How do we know that it's not going to go to bail out Hartford? We don't know that. I mean, if it's supposed to go to the teacher's fund, then let it go to the teacher's fund.
Well, I mean, that is, that is what everybody's perception is. Like I said, that's what should be happening. If you're calling it this, then that's where the money should go.
And I know that it respects the bond covenant for the teacher's pension fund, but I don't think in the bond covenant, as long as the money is there, is it going to be the money that comes from the towns? I don't think we know.
So
There's
now
a lot of flaws here.
You're going to be sitting on a couple areas of this. Is there anything that's coming up on the education side? I know part of the law is about you're not really allowed to drop off the level of your education funding within a town. So, like, say for example, I know Milford.
Minimum budget requirement, MBR.
Yeah, we have we're having a decline in our enrollment population. It's been a long-term trend from obviously decades ago down to now. Is there anything that's going to give any kind of relief to that, or take into account that in this whole formula? Because if you're asking towns or cities to continue to fund at the same level and you're not giving them that, and you're saying that, oh, you need less resources because you have less pupils, is there going to be anything that comes in which says, okay, how do we right size our school system if necessary?
That's a good question, and there are actually some good answers to it.
Okay.
And we should say at the outset, I'm ranking member of the Education Committee, so
Yes.
I am, as you say, involved in all that. We already have a law that we passed a couple of years ago that does give some leeway to towns when they have declining enrollment.
Okay.
There are several proposals this year. One of them is the governor's, as I understand it, that would grant even more leeway on that score. And we have several bills in the Education Committee that we're going to hear that deal with the minimum budget requirement. There are a few things in the governor's proposal that offer additional mandate relief to towns. Most of them are not on the education side. There are a few. We also have a couple of bills in the Education Committee that do not come from the governor. I introduced some of the concepts, some of my colleagues did. They are bipartisan for the most part, that offer more education mandate relief, but there's also some things on the town side, like raising the threshold for prevailing wage. Should I explain that? Right now, if a municipal body is doing a construction project, say,
Yep.
and it's worth over a certain amount of money, they have to pay prevailing union wages to the folks working on the project.
Whether they're union or not?
Well, I think they have to hire, I
Yeah.
don't know the exact rule, but they have to hire a contractor that will pay prevailing wage. We have been proposing for years to raise those thresholds so that it's not for cheaper projects. It's for, in other words, that would diminish the number of projects for which you have to pay
Sure.
prevailing wage. The governor has actually proposed to raise the threshold cost for the projects this time. There's a few other things like that that are in his budget proposal, which are mandate relief. But MBR is one of them. And I think that will remain in the Education Committee's sights, regardless of what budget proposal goes through, because a lot of towns are seeing declining enrollment in
Yeah.
Connecticut.
They are. I mean,
So-
and some are seeing, large gains in population. for their
Norwalk
school
is
children.
one of those places. But if your student population is decreasing, you shouldn't still be obligated to spend what you spent last year on your education
Right.
budget.
Well, I mean, that's reasonable. I mean, and that is one way that, we can look at this.
Exactly.
To be able to figure out that. I know I've talked to the head of our Board of Ed, and they're going to probably at some point, depending upon how this shakes out, they're going to mandate certain schools get closed from the town
Yeah.
side of the budget. And I went through this a few years ago, and we clamored because they were going to shut down one of our middle schools, and they were just going to have, one middle
Yeah.
school on one side of the town and one middle school on the other side of the town. And I didn't think it was fair to sort of bus everybody off in different directions. Plus, the amount of money that they were saving was not really an incredible amount of money, and we thought that there were other things because the property was directly downtown and everything else. But I know coming up this time around, it's basically, your aldermen are going to say, well, we only have this amount that we have to play with.
That's right.
Educational side, you're going to have to cut like by this much. And that does. And while I think that there is some leeway within there, it increases classroom size, and it stretches resources,
Yep.
and it takes away the quality of education, and certainly for my community, I've lived there for going on 11 years now. I've watched a lot of the businesses all of a sudden pick up, and the properties and everything else, and you're just getting to like the crest of the wave.
Yeah.
And instead of surfing it down and saying, okay, our property, taxes, might stay stable or go down, No, it's like it's like the waves just crashed over you, and you're like, okay.
Yeah, people are reeling from
Yeah.
this, Dominic, and with good reason, because the state is in very, very dire financial shape. It really is, and sometimes it's hard to digest what that means for one's own life, but it has this huge impact on social services, which have already been cut to the bone and which
Yeah.
remain that way.
Yep.
It's very, aid to towns has decreased, which you can understand. But then when you ask towns, it's one thing not to send as much to a town. It's another thing to say, oh, in town, you're going to send more to us. People are not paying less in their income taxes, which are redistributed. We expect that. Nobody thinks otherwise. But then the property taxes that everyone loves to hate, but at least knows that they're going to go for town services, are now being taken away for uses that may not be as specified as they look. And that is very, very hard to swallow. So again, people are still paying those income taxes, and now it's going to be even more on the property taxes, and they're going to go somewhere else. So this is very, very grave, and it does signal a great big change in the way that Connecticut is being managed. And all the while, then we have to answer the question, well, where else is it going to come from? Are you dreaming? And I'd make two remarks. The first one, the most important, is that part of this budget proposal is $700 million a year in anticipated unspecified savings.
Shock me if I'm remembering this correctly. Wasn't there a budget that occurred somewhere around 2011 or so?
Yes, sir.
That was supposed to have probably just about the exact same amount that they were going to find in cost savings from recommendations that they were going to have
from an employee suggestion
from
box.
the employee suggestion box.
That was a little less. It was $90 million a year, but we never saw a cent from that.
Right.
And there were some other contract negotiations that we didn't see a cent from either. Now it's $700 million this year and $800 million and change next year, this year, 18 and 19.
Right.
From savings that the governor hopes to generate from negotiations with state employee unions. Now, this is, I had thought originally when my caucus has talked about proposals, they've all been to do with, not all of them, but primarily state employee benefits costs.
Yeah. So what
in
people
other words,
pay for their health care, their drug benefits.
How overtime works.
Right.
Contributions into the retirement fund.
Yep.
Teachers pay 6% into their retirement fund. State employees pay anywhere between 0 and 2%. Right. I don't know anyone in the private sector who ever paid that little, but now people in the private sector don't have that kind of retirement fund anyway. These are defined benefit plans. So there are all sorts of things like that. I think we did, on occasion, propose freezing wages, and for a time, and you can understand that too. It turns out that this will take the $700 million from the first year. Apparently, what they did was they budgeted $300 million for negotiated salary increases in case that happens. So when they say $700 million in savings, that includes those $300 million. So maybe they won't raise them as much as it says. I mean, it's not new savings from what we spend already. It's savings from what we might be spending later. Some of it, 300 million of it. And so this is all, if you really seriously want to make structural changes that do not obligate us to move to some incredible Armageddon scenario, which is what you're seeing in the rest of this budget, then those structural changes for benefits costs have to be taken very seriously. And there's no telling which way that's going to go.
can't be playing voodoo economics, but
No.
it seems like we have been for a lot of years, and I guess, you know, I understand some of wanting to do things to work with as little money as you have, but it seems to me on the revenue side, we take away a lot of our sales tax and put it towards special projects. So like the transportation, you know, fund that's supposed to really, you know, take off, and was supposed to be this 30 years worth of
It's going into the red.
transformation. They're taking money from sales tax and diverting it into that. So you're having less revenue going into the general fund because you keep pulling off pieces and sticking it here
they
and there.
stuck it in transportation, then they took a bunch of it out and put it in the general fund. So that's one reason, you know, for the transportation lockbox being necessary. And you can just imagine this happening all over the place. Yes, they did divert 0.5% of the sales tax into transportation, but then they took some of it out. So it didn't even go for transportation. And that's just transportation operating, by the way. That's not bonding, which is something that we do need to do intelligently. There's $250 million going to the XL Center.
Well, I know this is a big one, and I guess, you know, we talk about bonding. I mean, number one, and Hartford, I'm sorry I'm picking on you today, but here's reality. The Dunkin' Donuts, like, you know, field, like they were supposed to have like the baseball team from that, you know, really got stolen from New Britain and brought over to Hartford. I mean, here's a project again that ran over. I do realize, you know, that the XL Center, the difficulty is at some point you need to do something because, but it's at what price point?
Yeah.
Do you do something? And I think the governor is imagining that we're going to have, you know, a professional sports franchise coming in there. As far as I'm concerned, I think UConn probably draws more than the Hartford Whalers ever did, because I used to go up to Hartford Civic Center to watch the Whalers, and the crowds weren't that big. You know, they're probably not that big for the Wolfpack. So I guess I got an issue with throwing away, you know, that kind of money to say that you're going to pull in a sports franchise, and I just get the feeling that we're going to get used, kind of like the way that we got used with the New England Patriots, you know, coming to Hartford to be the be-all to end-all, and then we're stuck with the building that's not producing revenue because people are
I think, you know, you really have to think priorities. The state doesn't have, in my book, the state doesn't have a real proactive economic development policy. Offering a really attractive deal to new businesses that come here. It's just got the putting out fires thing. Every time a big company threatens to leave, you put out the fire.
Yep.
I understand that states sometimes do have to put out those fires, but that seems to be all we do. Everything else is small peanuts.
And some of them were good deals too. I mean, Sikorsky was a very good deal for the community, and it had, you know, benefits built into it.
It had to be done. I mean, I voted for it, but I had misgivings that we had to.
Right.
We shouldn't have had to in the first place. But, you know, I don't see enough activity in terms of really soliciting businesses from outside and giving them a good tax deal for a while. Go ahead, it's not revenue we lose. We wouldn't have it at all if they didn't come. There are things like that we could do, but using something always that you pay for out of revenue we already have, or in some cases don't, is not in itself the foundation of an economic development policy. And it's disappointing to see how the priorities line up.
Which Coming back to something that I know that from a few years ago, I remember, we allowed United Technologies to utilize some of their
tax credits from one thing to use them for
lines.
something else.
How did that work out, considering that they sold Sikorsky's to Lockheed Martin? Did they take the money and run, or?
Well, they're still here. I mean,
They're
at the
Pratt and
time.
Whitney as well, but I think didn't Carrier, or we had like four or five pieces of United Technologies. It was
Well, I will say that because at that time I was ranking member of Commerce, so we met with the UTC management team to get a full briefing on this, and at the time they were worried that Sikorsky was going to have to close. And they wouldn't even, those tax credits and so on that were negotiated, Sikorsky was separate because
Okay.
they were anticipating Sikorsky would either have to move and downsize or it was going to have to close. Something was going to happen, but it was not in good shape. So the sale to Northrop Grumman was a good development. I don't know how it affected the UTC deal, but I think it wasn't unexpected.
okay.
And that's one I won't, I wouldn't, I think it's been good for Sikorsky to be able to thrive, and I think all we risked at that point was that they were going to be taken away, out of here, and the jobs would go with them. And, again, it just was, I said something on the floor when we took the vote, and I said, of course I'm going to vote for this, but I really don't like having to. I feel that we've been backed into a corner by the entire economic situation in Connecticut, and that's what we really ought to be looking to. This vote today does not an economic development policy make.
No, puts lipstick on a pig.
Exactly. It's taking care of an emergency, and that's not how you implement a policy. But anyway, we are just facing the horrible prospects that did not have to come to this.
It's, as they say, this has been a long time brewing, and I know even the last one with the agreement having to do with pensions in the state and facing the financial cliff and pushing this out. I said 20 years or so.
Oh, that's another thing. Again, for people who didn't follow it, the contract. It's not no. The unfunded liabilities that the state has for the State Employees Retirement System, SERS for short, went out until something like 2032.
Yeah.
And the state is so behind in those actuarial required contributions that the amount the state was going to owe per year was going to rise and rise and rise and rise and hit $6 billion in 1 year at one point. Now, rightly, the question came up was, do we refinance this? I get that. I mean, just the same way you would refinance a balloon mortgage. And that makes sense. There's no problem with that. So the governor came in with a plan to extend it by, 15 years, something like that, to refinance. Always when you refinance, of course, you end up paying more money because of the time value of money, right? So what could have been done when that was all negotiated was also to look at, what do you do to keep the obligations from growing? How could you negotiate some of those contributions that the state employees are actually making into the fund? How do you change that so that at least they don't get bigger, the amount that's owed doesn't get bigger every year? The rate that the fund was expected, the investments in the fund were expected to grow, used to be 8%. They did lower that to 6.9%, which is, who do you know who gets 6.9%? But even 6.9% is a lot higher than, one would expect over the years. Probably 5.5 would have been more realistic. At least they did lower it, but that wasn't part of the bill. They lowered that anyway, which was a good thing. But taking into account all of that, the bill that was offered to the General Assembly to vote on to do this refinance thing included no renegotiations with what employees pay and to the cost of the benefits, and extended the thing 15 years for a total additional cost of $11 billion to taxpayers, all of which is going to fall on the heads of, you know, people who don't yet pay taxes today because they're not old enough. There's that, and there's one more thing. I was in a legislative forum recently with a colleague who sits on the other side of the aisle, and we both said we felt that those negotiations should have taken place to change the percentage of state employee contributions and so on, how retirement is determined. And he said it had to be done now. We had to do something, so I went ahead and voted for it. We could have done those things, but it had to be done now. And I said, that's where you and I differ. It didn't have to be done just now.
You could have figured those pieces out.
We could have figured those pieces out, but look what else was in there. In that negotiation was reducing the amount of payment in 2018 and 2019 by $500 million one year and $600 or something the other year. That's why it had to be done now.
Because otherwise,
for political reasons,
our deficit
so
would have
that
been worse.
Our deficit would have been even more than $1.7 billion next year. And so this was done as, you know, for political reasons. Get it done now so it looks like we've accomplished something and it's not as bad as it really is, because after those 2 years, it's going to get bad again under this scenario. So why not just face the music? It didn't have to be done. Do it and do it better and take another few weeks. And so that's why there was a party line vote, yes and no. And I could not stomach putting $11 billion of excess taxes onto future generations and doing absolutely nothing to solve the problem.
I feel like sometimes we're on what I call like the long freight train running. It's like even when you put the brakes on and you try to stop it or you throw something out in front of it, it still keeps like chugging along. It might slow down a tiny bit, but it's not really facing the music. I mean, it's you know what, all these numbers are just hard to stomach, but this is not like new news. I mean, all these actuarial figures have been out there for, I would probably guess, like 10 plus years. They knew when this stuff was going to hit.
Absolutely. And you know, then there's that exercise. Everybody goes through the game of let's blame the governors. You know, it wasn't just Democrats, it was Republicans. That's exactly right. It was governors of both parties. But it was the legislature of only one. And the legislature has had the same majority with the exception of 2 years for the last 40 years. So
well, some of the things I do remember are our good friend in jail.
Exactly.
Johnny R. out there. I remember when he shut down government because I know it stopped payments to the place I was.
I don't think we were very well served by any of our governors for a really long time.
Unfortunately, there has to be found a better way to do this, because what he did last time around by doing some of those things ended up costing us $240 million.
Absolutely.
You know, 5-10 years down the line, when the court system come back and says,
no disagreement there, and he's the one who negotiated the state employee contract till 2017, which Governor Malloy then extended to 2022. But all of this is true.
Which begs the question: what is he doing in order to get concessions? Because
we don't know.
I mean, this goes out to 2021, the current agreement.
2022.
Right. So
we don't know.
How much further is that going to be pushed out in order?
I hope not pushed out, because you know, it's really hamstringing the ability of the state to get its finances in order. But all that said, I mean, having just said what I said, it really doesn't matter who did what. We have to fix it. No, and that's what we really want to see. But to shift this to towns is a very, very hard thing. Number one, for taxpayers to swallow, and number two, frankly, to implement.
Yeah.
So I think we will see massive change in this proposal before we're done, but I couldn't tell you how.
No. As they say, this is the starting point of where things get negotiated from, and obviously you have to have a starting point, and I think he's picked a starting point that nobody likes. So
That's for sure.
If you're going to throw it out there, you make people feel the worst amount of pain that they could possibly feel. So as you ease it back, they all go, "Whew, that could have been a lot worse."
Well, that's been the history since 2011.
Yes.
The first proposal was always, unacceptable to everybody. I think the mayor of Hartford likes it, though.
I'm sure he does.
He's thrilled.
I'm sure he does, and you know what? I know he's a protege of our governor, and I know his general counsel, who manages to avoid me in the halls of the LOB very well, and puts out an offer to meet and never actually does. Who worked in the lieutenant governor's office. I still hold you accountable for some of those words that you gave me. It has something to do with it as well, but I won't take out my political grudges and name them out fully. But
Yeah, I mean that's always a particularly non-effective exercise, isn't it?
No, but you know what? Somehow I feel better for like a couple
know.
of minutes to do. So I know we're down to the last 3 minutes, and you. Do you have anything you want to say to your constituents out there?
Well, I would encourage everyone to let the governor know how you feel about these proposals. It will also be, there's a couple of things that are important. The Appropriations Committee, again, I don't sit on it anymore, I sit on Finance. The Appropriations Committee will hold budget hearings on his proposal this week and next week. The public usually is invited to come from either 4 in the afternoon or 6 in the afternoon. Each day is a different part of the budget. The governor's education proposals will be heard to some extent in appropriations, but we actually have the governor's education bills in the Education Committee. So we will be hearing those within the next 2 weeks, and I would encourage everyone to come and offer their thoughts on mandate relief, which is a big deal. Certainly for the towns in my district. We have one that is, if the state isn't giving us any money, then you're not allowed to tell us what to do. That's a very important mandate relief bill. And there's another one as well, and then there's also the budget. So stay tuned. There's lots of opportunities to speak.
And as I do, because I'm actually a CTN junkie, you're obviously public access is very helpful within that, but certainly watching CTN on TV to find out exactly what's going on, because you can't hold people accountable if you don't listen or watch what's happening
Right.
within it. But
CTN is now channel 59 in Fairfield County.
there we go. All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming down here. I don't know that we
Thanks
solved
for
any of the
having me.
problems altogether, but you know what? Sometimes you have to understand what the problems are before
Exactly.
you can come up with solutions, and
And you do a great job of making sure people are informed.
that's what we try to do here at Street Talk, and obviously we'll be back online. I know coming up. We're going to have somebody from the National Organization of Rare Diseases, as Rare Disease Day is February 28th. For anybody that would like to come up to the Legislative Office building, we will be there in the morning. And after that, I have my good friend and Alderman Brian Anderson from Milford on for our civics lesson about how town government works in Milford. So for all you guys, have a wonderful night.